After years of calling anyone who didn't agree with his position on the carbon tax all kinds of names, including climate denier, Stephen Guilbeault has decided to do a 180 on his position on the carbon tax and is now in support of removing it. Is he being genuine, or is he just trying to get your vote? Welcome to the Canadian Shield. My name is Sterling. I'm your host. For those of you who think that you might have misheard me, I'll say it again. Stephen Guilbeault is claiming that he has changed his position on the carbon tax. He says that he's doing it because Mark Carney wants him to, and because he's trying to keep his job. No surprise there. He was on Vasi Capello's show Power Play, defending some of his alterations and changes in position and trying to deny some of the things that he has been saying and screaming over the last few years.
Hi, Minister Guilbeault. Good to see you again. Thank you for making the time.
My pleasure, Vashi.
I have a number of questions on sort of the wider implications of some of the executive orders around the environment from President Trump, but I did want to start off on your endorsement of Mark Carney in the leadership race. Every single candidate is either backing off increasing the carbon tax, the consumer portion of it, or getting rid of it altogether, including your chosen candidate. Now, you sound like you'd be okay with that. All of a sudden yesterday I was listening to your comments, and I remember doing multiple interviews with you in which you told me that politicians who cave into pressure on the carbon tax don't care about climate change. How can you now be one of them?
That's an excellent question. I too would like to know how he justifies changing positions so dramatically after spending years disparaging and demeaning anyone who didn't agree with him on that position. I would also like to know how he can do that and still look at himself in the mirror.
I mean, what I've said, Vashi, is that the consumer component of our carbon pricing system is a good policy, and it's a policy that works. It is helping us reduce emissions. It is putting more money in people's pocket for the majority of Canadians where the federal system applies. But at the same time, I'm forced to recognize that largely due to Pierre Poilievre's campaign to frankly lie and misguide Canadians, it has become very unpopular.
I'm going to be honest with you. One of my biggest issues with Stephen Guilbeault is his insistence that it's putting money in people's pockets. It's not. The parliamentary budgetary officer is an economist who has a floor, if not a building, of people who are all doing calculations, not to mention all of the sophisticated software that goes along with that. They have years of training and understanding how to calculate incurred costs. Stephen Guilbeault, by contrast, climbs up on people's houses or climbs to the CN Tower with a banner and demands that you take him seriously on issues of economy. So him sitting there trying to convince you that 60% of the population isn't losing money on the carbon tax irks me, because the parliamentary budgetary officer found that 60% of Canadians are losing money, and they will continue to lose money over the next 7 or 8 years, so long as they continue to increase it, because they're simply not going to be able to give you more money than they're bringing in. The other issue I have with what Stephen Guilbeault said is he wants to make it seem like you're not smart enough to know when you're losing money on the carbon tax. You're not smart enough to pay attention to how much things are increasing because of the carbon tax. No. You're all being led astray, led around by the nose by Pierre Poilievre. That's all. It's not that you are thinking for yourself. No, it's not that you understand basic, money in, money out and how to budget. No. It's because of Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives saying to you, axe the tax.
And I mean, of course, I would like for the consumer component of pricing to continue moving forward. But the reality is that it's not supported by the NDP. Even so, environmental organizations are telling me, listen, Minister, it's too unpopular. And Mr. Carney's been very clear. He said, if we want to remove something from the equation in terms of fighting for climate change, we have to be able to put something else.
Mr. Carney has been very clear. If we're going to remove this part of the carbon tax, we're going to have to find a clever way to put a different carbon tax, because they haven't changed their position. They are just willing to tell you whatever you want to hear so they can secure your vote.
I'll read you exactly what you told me 9 months ago. If there's a measure somewhere that someone can find and point to me that will help us achieve 10% of 2030 targets at no extra cost to consumers lying around under a rock somewhere, someone needs to show it to me because I haven't seen it. Have you seen it now? Because I don't understand what's changed in the interim other than Justin Trudeau leaving.
As I said, I mean, the fact that the leadership candidates have said that they wanted to reconsider the consumer portion of carbon pricing. I mean, I basically have two choices here. I can stay in the party and continue help fighting to protect the environment, fighting climate change, or go pick my bags and go home.
I remember that interview when he made that crack about if there's a better way, then nobody has shown it to me. And then he followed it up by saying, and I know there's no better way because we've already looked at all the ways. And then he said just now, oh, well, if I don't change my position, I might as well just pack my bags and go home. Essentially admitting that he's only doing it to get your vote. That he doesn't believe what he said before or what he's saying now. Either way, how can you trust him with your vote? How can you trust him to not be 5 minutes into the job, say, oh, it didn't work. We're going to have to bring the carbon tax back. And because you elected us for 4 years, we're going to stall yet again another election like we've been doing now for already a year and a half.
Okay, well, if we don't have the fuel charge anymore, what else can we do to compensate? And there are possibilities. And Mark Carney has said exactly that. Like if we want to remove something from the equation in terms of our arsenal to fight climate change, then we have to come up with a new measure or use some of the existing measures, but maybe tighten them up a little bit so that they give us more bang for our bucks.
That I ask, are you so sure the Liberal Party will continue to be best positioned, and not vis-a-vis the Conservatives, who, you're right, have detailed nothing and deserve hard questions about that. But just in general, I'm thinking of other things that you have put on the table that you have recently walked back, including, for example, a net zero electricity grid, which was supposed to be 2035 and is now 2050.
Two very significant things were said there. One, Mark Carney plans on putting the carbon tax back on. He will just find another way to do it. He doesn't want to protect the economy. He's just going to make regulations for businesses tougher. He's going to harm businesses. He's going to harm production. He's going to do all the things that are the opposite of what Trump's been telling the world that he's about to do. He's also, Mark Carney, going to do all the things that are opposite for most of the world, right? I mean, that's something to remember. They don't follow the carbon tax in China, Saudi Arabia, India. And all of these economies are making at least some money. They have better economies than Canada does because of restrictions and regulations that people like Mark Carney like to put on there so that he makes money and the rest of us suffer. As for 2050 versus 2035, no matter what Stephen Guilbeault says, he's not being honest. Because Danielle Smith was the one who said 2035 is not doable. We're going to have to target 2050. And now we hear the Liberals saying, oh, yeah, no, 2050. Yeah, that's what we're going to do. But the Conservatives have been saying 2050 because it's almost like the Conservatives were thinking their way through it. They weren't being ideologues. They weren't being zealots. They were just looking at the math, doing the calculations and saying, we trust the science of mathematics. And so we will say that we could probably pull this off by 2050.
In terms of the cap on oil and gas emissions, I mean, I continue to believe that it is a good piece of policy, and I have spoken with Mark Carney about that, and he shares my belief on that. So we are committed to continue moving forward with that.
Strangely, I don't hear Mark Carney pushing for a cap on oil and gas production in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Venezuela, and in Libya. He has money invested in all of these countries, and yet he's not asking them to put a cap on their oil and gas production. It's very strange, very contradictory. I wonder why he's telling you, Stephen Guilbeault, that he's going to do it in Canada, whereas he's not going to do it anywhere else. Of course, you don't really care as long as you hear what you want to hear, as long as you throw your endorsement to Mark Carney under the premise that once you guys get elected, you'll be able to go back on every campaign promise you made and just tighten the screws on the environment and the economy in an effort to put us all back into the Stone Ages. Speaking of Mark Carney, I wonder where he is. He made an announcement about how he's running for leadership of the Liberal Party, and then I haven't heard a sound from him since. Does he feel that he only has to win over certain people inside the Liberal Party and everything else is assured? Or is he afraid that the independent media might give him too much scrutiny? Also, what riding is he attempting to represent? Because if he becomes Prime Minister on March 9th, he's not allowed to walk into the House of Commons. He's not a sitting member of Parliament. Oh, sure, he'll be Prime Minister, but he won't be a sitting member of Parliament.
From President Trump, ranging from everything from withdrawing from Paris climate to declaring an energy emergency, and in his inauguration speech talking about drill, baby, drill. I looked also, for example, you're supporting Mark Carney. He had been at the helm of this net zero banking initiative. 4 of Canada's big banks have now withdrawn from it, following the lead of a number of big banks in the United States. Why are people who care a lot about the climate emergency losing the argument right now? And what do you think the bigger impact of that is?
And of course, the president can say, drill, baby, drill. But the reality of the oil and gas sector is that, yes, there is a part of the equation is the offer, how much you can produce. But the other part of the equation is demand. And according to the International Energy Agency, which is a very credible international organization on these issues, demand for oil is going to peak in the coming 2, maybe 3 years. And by 2030, will be reduced by about 6%, maybe 5 or 6%.
Oh, come on. I hate it when these guys, they buy up an organization and then they get that organization to say something, like CTV will say, well, I heard it on CBC, or he will say that the energy, electrical, whatever he said, organization is predicting that oil and gas demand will be down 6%. He goes on to say that it's because, people are going electric. Most of the electric generating stations that are being built right now are being fueled by natural gas, liquid natural gas. I mean, it's not magic, right? You have to actually burn something to boil the water. Remember that. Electrical generation is to make these plants, to have the manufacturing, is done with boiled water for the most part. Except for wind, obviously. In addition to that, there's a lot of places on Earth that don't have electricity that are still waiting to have it. Appreciate that in your mind. They have roving brownouts in California. What can you imagine that they have in, say, I don't know, India or Africa? Do you want me to believe that those people don't want electricity? And that if the market begins to dip in the United States of America, that some person working on the board for the gas won't go to a country in Africa and say, hey, we can give you all the gas you need to fire up an electrical generating station and we will help you build it. Because China's been doing it all over the place. That's how they got into Mexico. That's how they get into many parts of Africa. They don't have any problem doing it because they know that, and those people will go for it. The people living there will go for it because they want electricity. I just feel that what we heard there was a lot of cope, right? Stephen Guilbeault is probably coping a lot right now because everyone around him has decided that they are in fact wanting to appease the voter with the carbon tax. And they have all decided they're going to axe the tax. All of them. Wow. I mean, how can you trust a group of people that are so willing to tell you something that is completely opposite to what they were just telling you 6 months ago? They can't be trusted. They're just going to take your vote and do whatever they want to do. I do like the idea that all of those banks have left the trillions of dollars they've taken away, and the impact of Mark Carney not being able to push around small businesses because he has a friend that works at that bank. And that's something that we all need to look at, that the banks, the second that they had an opportunity, have decided to abandon ESG. Because they realize there's no money in ESG. Because they realize that by opening the market wide, by cranking the taps, they will make more money. Everybody will make more money. And when everybody makes more money, the banks make more money. That's how it works. That's what we call the economy. Everyone wants to put the government on the hot plate, but you have to appreciate that it's the banks that drive, that earn a lot of the money. That the top of the pyramid is always a bank somewhere. And they are just saying to themselves, well, we've been putting up for 20 years of this economic destruction initiated by the WEF and people like Mark Carney. And we have decided now, with all of the far left government, socialist governments failing all over the world, that we will simply begin to invest, and maybe we can all make a little money and buy that extra Ferrari or whatever it is they spend their money on.
Just very quickly, though, are you so sure that that will be the case, given, for example, something like the EV mandate in the United States? And again, if this were a smaller country in Europe, not the end of the world, but this is the United States. They've just, again, through executive order, removed the EV mandate. Is that electrification of transportation actually going to happen to the degree that you or even the International Energy Agency have analyzed that it will?
Well, obviously, the U.S. federal government removing this regulation will slow the pace of EV adoption in the U.S., but it's not the end of it, because you have about 20, if not 22 U.S. states that have their own EV mandates.
22 states have their own EV mandates, so those can't be reversed. Does everyone remember that the Liberal government promised tax breaks and huge amounts of tax dollars to 3 battery companies that were opening up, in 2 of them in Southern Ontario and 1 of them in British Columbia, which have all now stopped because there's no money in the battery, and because most of Canada can't charge the battery. Do you imagine in your mind that those companies that were coming in had the money themselves, or were they going to use one of these banks that has now decided they are no longer following the ESG? I think that those states will find that those banks are no longer willing to invest in the ESG either. It's fine for the bank to invest in it when they have the regulations that says that everybody must drive it. But when the market fell out, when the people decided that the electric car wasn't going to work, everyone moved away from that. They kind of shoot themselves in the foot, because this AI stuff requires enormous amounts of electricity. And you want people to run the lines to charge their car, while companies take the lines to charge their EI data centers, as they're calling them. The idea that Stephen Guilbeault is clinging to this antiquated notion of electricity makes me laugh. Oh, sure, they're going to make all kinds of power plants, and they're going to use gas. Well, hopefully gas, because coal is not one that we want them to be using. I can see the appeal to phasing out coal, to having no coal being exported by Canada, to having no coal being used. And I don't mean to, hurt anybody's feeling out there in British Columbia, where they have those massive coals, or in Virginia. I'm just simply saying that when we send that coal overseas, they don't put filters on their stacks, and that stuff goes straight up into the air. When we use it, in developed countries, we can make sure that we can spray it and all of the filters and keep it clean, and then bury it in the ground. The emissions clean, I should say. Now, that's a different video. I will say only in this one that I don't believe that the electrification that they dreamt was going to happen is ever going to happen, because they simply can't hold the charge inside of the car. And it's fine for a guy living in downtown New York to have something electric, just like it's fine for a guy in Hong Kong to have something electric. But when you say to yourself, well, I live, 75 miles from work, and when I get to work, sometimes I forget to charge my car, and all of the things that go along with that. So to say the 22 states are still have a mandate, they may very well, but you'll find that the subsidies that they were going to be getting, or the companies that were getting the funding from the various banks, are now going to have trouble with the financing, as they'll call it. There's no more money coming out of the tax dollar, and they'll find other reasons and needs to suspend it, and that's the nature of the free market. Stephen Guilbeault and the Liberal Party, along with Mark Carney, they're nobody agrees with them anymore, and they just simply can't accept that. They're in the minority. Of course, Mark Carney is probably more worried about how much those banks leaving him insults him or embarrasses him. And that's probably one of the reasons that we haven't heard from him, because they don't want to be asking him about all of the banks that have abandoned the ESG. All right, I'm going to wrap here. I want to thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next time.